Two survivors, a man scarred by the past and a dog wounded by life, meet at the darkest moment of their journeys. Together, they embark on a story of overcoming, trust and hope, where every step taken is a fight against their own ghosts. Can Nate and Shadow heal each other's scars and discover that even in the greatest shadows there is light? Get ready for an emotional journey that will touch your heart and hold your attention until the very last moment. The morning light filtered through dusty blinds, casting prison bar shadows across Nathan Riley's unmade bed. 3 hours. He'd managed 3 hours of sleep before the nightmares dragged him back to consciousness, his sheets damp with sweat and his heart hammering against his ribs. The same routine, different day. Nate ran his trembling fingers through his unkempt hair, trying to ground himself in the present moment like Dr. Carter had taught him. 5 things he could see: the coffee mug from yesterday, his wrinkled army jacket hanging on the door, the pile of unopened mail on his desk, the photograph face down on his nightstand, and the orange prescription bottle he'd been avoiding. The house creaked around him, too big and too empty. He'd inherited it from his grandmother 6 months ago, right after his discharge, when he needed a place to disappear. The quiet suburb of Bristol, Connecticut, seemed as good a place as any to fade away. The neighbors had tried to welcome him at first, but his silence and closed doors eventually sent the message. All except Maggie Sanders, who stubbornly left casseroles on his porch every Sunday, like clockwork. His phone buzzed, another missed appointment with Dr. Carter. 4th one this month. The text was gentle but firm: "Nate, I know things are difficult, but we need to maintain consistency in your treatment. Please call my office to reschedule." Nate let the phone clatter back onto the nightstand. Dr. Evelyn Carter meant well, but how could he explain that some days, just getting out of bed felt like scaling a mountain? That every car backfire sent him diving for cover? That the weight of surviving when others hadn't made each breath feel like a betrayal? The sound of barking drew him to the window. Across the street, animal control officers were attempting to corner what looked like a large black dog. The animal's ribs showed through its matted fur, and even from this distance, Nate could see the way it favored its right hind leg. Something about its desperate movements and the wild fear in its eyes struck a chord deep within him. "Come on, boy," one officer called, advancing with a catch-pole. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." The dog backed away, its tail tucked so tightly beneath it that it was almost invisible. Its eyes darted frantically between the officers, searching for an escape route. Nate recognized that look. He'd seen it in the eyes of his fellow soldiers in moments of pure terror, in his own reflection on particularly bad nights. Before he could process what he was doing, Nate was pulling on his boots and heading for the front door. His hand hesitated on the doorknob. He hadn't left the house in 3 days. The world outside felt too bright, too loud, too full of unknowns. But something about that dog's desperation called to him, echoing his own internal struggles. "Wait." His voice was hoarse from disuse as he stepped onto his porch. The officers turned, surprised to see the neighborhood recluse emerging from his self-imposed exile. The dog used their momentary distraction to bolt, limping rapidly down the street. "Sir, please stay back," one officer warned. "This dog is dangerous. It's already bitten 2 people trying to help it." Nate barely heard them. His eyes were fixed on the dog, which had backed itself into a corner between a fence and a garden shed. He could see its chest heaving with panic, its eyes wild with fear. In that moment, he saw himself, trapped, hurting, and unable to trust that help might actually be help. "Let me try," he said quietly, surprising himself as much as the officers. "Please. I think I understand him." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. "Sir, this isn't a pet. It's a stray that's been causing problems in the area for weeks. It needs professional handling." 10 minutes, Nate insisted, his voice finding strength he didn't know he still possessed. "Give me 10 minutes with him." Maybe it was something in his tone, or maybe it was the unexpected authority that still lingered from his military days, but the officers stepped back. 10 minutes, they agreed reluctantly. But if that dog shows any signs of aggression, we're stepping in. Nate approached slowly, his movements deliberate and calm despite the tremor in his hands. The dog's growl was low and continuous, a rumble of fear dressed up as threat. Nate recognized that too, how terror could manifest as aggression, how hurt could look like anger. "I know," he murmured, stopping several feet away and sitting down on the grass. "I know what it's like when the whole world feels like a threat. When every shadow might be hiding something that wants to hurt you." The dog's growl faltered slightly, its ears twitching at the sound of Nate's quiet voice. Nate continued speaking, not moving closer, just letting his words fill the space between them. "You and me, we're carrying around the same kind of shadows, aren't we? The ones that follow you even when the sun is directly overhead. The ones that make it impossible to believe in safety anymore." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dog's rigid posture began to soften. Its growl faded to occasional rumbles, then to silence. Nate reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of the breakfast sandwich Maggie had left on his porch that morning, the breakfast he hadn't been able to eat. "I'm not going to tell you it's okay," he said, placing the food on the ground between them. "Because it's not okay, what happened to you. But maybe we could be not okay together for a while." The dog's nose twitched, and for the first time, its eyes met Nate's directly. In that moment of connection, something shifted in the air between them. Two broken beings, recognizing in each other a mirror of their own pain. Neither Nate nor the dog moved for several long minutes. The officers watched in amazed silence as the animal gradually inched forward, its movements cautious but deliberate. When it finally took the food from the spot where Nate had placed it, he saw what the officers hadn't, the old collar, nearly hidden by matted fur, suggesting this wasn't just a stray. This was someone's beloved pet, lost or abandoned, carrying its own war wounds. "What do you say?" Nate asked softly. "Want to try trusting someone again? We could start small. Maybe just today." The dog's tail, still low, gave a single, hesitant wag. And in that small gesture, in that tiny moment of trust, Nate felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not the kind that promised everything would be fine, but the kind that whispered maybe, just maybe, they could both find their way back to the light, one small step at a time. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making Nate's skin crawl. He sat in the corner of the waiting room, as far from other people as possible, while Shadow pressed against his leg, trembling. The dog hadn't left his side since that morning, following him home with a peculiar mix of wariness and desperate need that Nate understood all too well. "Mr. Riley?" The receptionist's voice made him flinch. "Dr. Walsh can see you now." Getting Shadow into the examination room was a delicate operation. The dog balked at the doorway, his nails scraping against the linoleum floor. Nate knelt beside him, ignoring the curious stares from the clinic staff. "Together, remember," he murmured. "Small steps." The veterinarian, Dr. Walsh, was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and patience in her eyes. She took one look at Shadow's defensive posture and Nate's rigid stance and seemed to understand immediately. "Let's give him a moment to adjust," she said, settling onto a rolling stool at a careful distance. "You found him this morning?" Nate nodded, his hand resting lightly on Shadow's back. "Animal control was trying to catch him. He's been in the neighborhood for weeks, apparently." Dr. Walsh made a note on her tablet. "And you managed to gain his trust? That's quite remarkable, considering his condition." She studied Shadow with professional concern. "He shows signs of long-term abuse and neglect. The limp in his back leg, the scars under his fur." She trailed off, watching Shadow's reactions to her voice. "Can you help him?" Nate asked, his throat tight. "We'll start with the basics today, checking for a microchip, treating any immediate medical concerns." "But Mr. Riley." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "A dog with this level of trauma will need more than just physical healing. Are you prepared for that commitment? The question hit Nate like a physical blow. Was he prepared? He could barely take care of himself most days. His grandmother's house was a mess of unwashed dishes and unopened mail. He hadn't held a real conversation with anyone except Dr. Carter in months. And yet. I understand trauma, he said quietly, surprising himself with his honesty. And I understand needing someone who won't give up on you. Dr. Walsh's expression softened. Yes, I believe you do. She turned to her computer. Let me enter his information. Does he have a name? Nate looked down at the black dog, taking in his dark fur and the way he seemed to shrink into the shadows of the room. Shadow, he said. His name is Shadow. The examination that followed was a careful dance of trust and patience. Dr. Walsh moved slowly, narrating each action before she made it. Shadow tolerated the handling with tense resignation, his eyes never leaving Nate's face. No microchip, Dr. Walsh announced after scanning him. Given his condition, he's probably been on his own for several months at least. He's severely undernourished, has multiple old injuries that healed poorly, and needs immediate treatment for parasites and infections. She prescribed a regimen of medications and a special diet, explaining each element in detail. Nate listened with military focus, making mental notes of dosages and schedules. This was a mission. He could handle missions. One more thing, Dr. Walsh said as they prepared to leave. There's a trainer I know who specializes in rehabilitating traumatized dogs. Her name is Rachel Chen. I'd strongly recommend working with her. Shadow's road to recovery will be challenging, and you'll both need support. In the parking lot, Nate stared at the stack of prescriptions and instruction sheets in his hand. The magnitude of what he'd taken on was starting to sink in. Shadow sat beside his car, watching him with those knowing eyes. Nathan? The voice made him turn. Maggie Sanders stood a few spaces away, holding a cat carrier. Her presence was unexpected but somehow not unwelcome, maybe because she'd been the only person in the neighborhood who hadn't given up on him. I saw you come in earlier, she said, approaching slowly. Is this the dog everyone's been talking about? Shadow tensed but didn't growl, seeming to pick up on Nate's subtle relaxation at Maggie's presence. She stopped at a respectful distance, her eyes taking in the scene with gentle understanding. His name is Shadow, Nate found himself saying. He's going to be staying with me for a while. Maggie's smile was warm. That's really good, Nathan. She hesitated, then added, you know, I volunteer at the animal shelter sometimes. If you need any supplies, food, bowls, a bed, I'd be happy to help. The old Nate would have refused immediately, retreating behind his walls of isolation. But Shadow's weight against his leg reminded him that he wasn't just making decisions for himself anymore. That would be helpful, he admitted. I don't really know what I need. Well, lucky for you, I'm an expert at pet shopping. Her tone was light, but her eyes held deeper understanding. How about I drop some basics by this evening? No need to invite me in, I can leave everything on the porch, like usual. The mention of her regular food deliveries brought a flush of shame to Nate's cheeks. Maggie, about all those meals. She waved off his words. Neighbors help neighbors, Nathan. That's all there is to it. She glanced down at Shadow, who had relaxed slightly during their conversation. Looks like you're learning that yourself. The drive home was quiet, Shadow curled up in the back seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. Nate caught glimpses of him in the rearview mirror and wondered if the dog was as overwhelmed as he was by the day's changes. Back at the house, Shadow followed him inside, moving cautiously through each room as if mapping escape routes. Nate watched him explore, suddenly seeing his grandmother's house through new eyes. The drawn curtains, the cluttered surfaces, the lingering darkness, it wasn't just his cave anymore. It needed to become a home. He opened a curtain, letting afternoon sunlight stream into the living room. Shadow found a patch of sun and settled into it, his vigilant posture gradually softening. "Small steps," Nate repeated, more to himself than to Shadow. He picked up his phone and, before he could talk himself out of it, dialed Dr. Carter's office. "Hello, this is Nathan Riley. I'd like to reschedule my appointment." He paused, watching Shadow doze in the sunlight. "And I have some things to tell Dr. Carter about." The nightmare came without warning, as it always did. Nate was back in Kandahar, the heat pressing against him like a physical weight, the smell of burning fuel thick in his throat. The explosion hadn't happened yet, but he knew it was coming. Any second now, Roberts would step forward, would turn to say something with that easy smile of his, and then, a wet nose pressed against his cheek, followed by a soft whine. Nate's eyes snapped open to find Shadow standing beside his bed, dark eyes fixed on him with concern. The dog's presence anchored him to reality, the cool Connecticut air, the distant sound of crickets, the gentle tick of his grandmother's old clock downstairs. "I'm okay, buddy," he whispered, his voice shaky. Shadow didn't move, maintaining his vigilant watch until Nate's breathing steadied. It had been 3 days since they'd come home from the vet, and already Shadow seemed to sense when the shadows in Nate's mind grew too dark. Morning light was starting to creep through the windows. No point trying to go back to sleep now. Nate swung his legs over the side of the bed, noting with surprise that he'd managed nearly 5 hours before the nightmare hit, longer than usual. Downstairs, the house was starting to look different. Maggie's basic supplies had turned out to be an entire pet store's worth of items, a plush bed, which Shadow approached with suspicious fascination, stainless steel bowls, a variety of toys, still untouched, and enough high-quality dog food to feed a small pack. The curtains stayed open now, at least during the day, and Nate had managed to clear most of the clutter from the main living areas. Shadow followed him to the kitchen, his movements still cautious but more fluid than they had been. The limp was less pronounced thanks to the medication, and regular meals were already beginning to fill out his hollow frame. "Breakfast first," Nate said, measuring out Shadow's special dietary food, then meds. He'd created a schedule, posted on the refrigerator, feeding times, medication doses, future vet appointments. The structure helped them both. As Shadow ate, Nate checked his phone. There was a text from Rachel Chen, the trainer Dr. Walsh had recommended, "Looking forward to meeting you and Shadow today at 10. Remember, this first session is just about observation and building rapport." His stomach tightened. He'd been both anticipating and dreading this appointment. Shadow needed professional help, but the idea of letting a stranger into his space, of having to interact and explain and be present, made his pulse quicken. "We can do this," he told Shadow, who had finished eating and was watching him with those knowing eyes. "Together, right?" The morning routine they'd established helped calm his nerves. Clean Shadow's water bowl, take him for a short walk around the yard, they weren't ready for the neighborhood yet, give him his medications hidden in a small piece of chicken, a trick Maggie had suggested. At precisely 10 a.m., a car pulled into his driveway. Rachel Chen turned out to be a compact woman in her late 30s, dressed in cargo pants and a practical jacket. She moved with deliberate grace as she approached the house, her body language calm and controlled. "Mr. Riley. I'm Rachel." Her voice was steady and unrushed. "Thank you for trusting me to work with you and Shadow." Shadow positioned himself between Nate and the newcomer, not growling but radiating tension. Rachel didn't look directly at him, instead keeping her body language loose and angled slightly away. "Please, come in," Nate managed, the formal greeting feeling strange on his tongue. He led her to the living room, where she took in the space with professional interest. "Dr. Walsh filled me in on Shadow's medical history," Rachel said, settling onto the edge of an armchair. "But I'd like to hear from you about these past few days. How has he been adjusting?" As Nate described their developing routine, Rachel observed Shadow's behavior, the way he stayed close to Nate, his reactions to different sounds, how he positioned himself in relation to the exits. "He's bonded to you very quickly," she noted. That's both wonderful and challenging. Dogs with severe trauma often form intense attachments to their rescuers. It can become a kind of emotional dependency that, while understandable, can hinder their overall rehabilitation. Something about her words struck uncomfortably close to home. Nate thought about his own dependency on isolation, how it felt safer to hide away than to face the world. "What do we need to do?" he asked. Rachel smiled gently. "First, we accept that healing isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. The goal isn't to erase the trauma, that's not possible. The goal is to build new neural pathways, new associations that can exist alongside the old fears." She reached into her bag and pulled out a book, placing it on the coffee table. "This is for you. It's about understanding canine body language and stress signals. The better you can read Shadow's communication, the more you can help him feel secure." As she explained basic concepts about trauma responses in dogs, Nate found himself drawing parallels to his sessions with Dr. Carter. The hypervigilance, the startle responses, the difficulty distinguishing between real and perceived threats, Shadow's behaviors mirrored his own struggles. "One thing that's crucial," Rachel emphasized, "is establishing a safe space, a place where Shadow can retreat when he feels overwhelmed. It should be quiet, partially enclosed, and completely his." Nate thought about his own tendency to retreat to his bedroom when the world became too much. "Like a bunker," he said quietly. Rachel's eyes showed understanding. "Exactly. A place to regroup, not to hide forever. Speaking of which." She glanced around the room. "Would you be comfortable if we tried a small exercise? Nothing intense, just teaching Shadow that new experiences can be positive." For the next 20 minutes, Rachel demonstrated how to use gentle encouragement and high-value treats to help Shadow investigate new objects, in this case, a simple rubber ball she'd brought. The dog's initial wariness gradually gave way to cautious curiosity. "Good," Rachel praised, watching Shadow gently nose the ball. "See how his ears are relaxed now. How he's choosing to engage rather than just tolerating. That's what we want to encourage." Before leaving, she set up a regular schedule of twice-weekly sessions. "Remember," she said at the door, "you're not just Shadow's rescuer, you're his rehabilitation partner. That means taking care of yourself is part of taking care of him." After she left, Nate sat on the floor beside Shadow, who was still investigating the ball with newfound interest. "Neural pathways," he murmured, running his hand along Shadow's slowly healing flank. "New associations." His phone buzzed, a reminder of tomorrow's appointment with Dr. Carter. For the first time, he didn't immediately feel the urge to cancel. Maybe it was time to build some new pathways of his own. Dr. Carter's office hadn't changed in the weeks since Nate's last visit. The same muted green walls, the same carefully arranged furniture, the same collection of seemingly random objects on her desk that he now recognized as fidget toys for anxious patients. What had changed was Nate himself, though he couldn't quite explain how. "You look different," Dr. Carter said, settling into her chair with her usual quiet grace. She was younger than most of the VA therapists, with warm brown eyes that seemed to see straight through his defenses. More present. Nate shifted in his seat, his fingers absently running over the leather leash in his hands. Shadow was at home. Rachel had emphasized the importance of gradually building his independence, but having the leash helped somehow. A tangible reminder of why he was here. "I got a dog," he said, the words falling into the comfortable silence between them. "Or maybe he got me. I'm not sure yet." Dr. Carter's expression remained neutral, but her eyes showed interest. "Tell me about that." So he did. The words came easier than they ever had before, spilling out in a steady stream as he described that morning with Animal Control, the visit to Dr. Walsh, the careful dance of trust he and Shadow were learning together. Dr. Carter listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. "It sounds like you see yourself in Shadow," she observed when he finally fell silent. "He was right there in front of my house," Nate said, his voice dropping. Right there, and everyone saw him hurting, but they couldn't reach him. Couldn't help him. He swallowed hard. Just like you. Dr. Carter supplied gently. Like Roberts. The name felt like glass in his throat. He was right there too. Right in front of me, and I couldn't, his hands clenched around the leash. Dr. Carter waited, giving him space to find his words. They'd circled this moment for months, never quite breaking through to the core of his trauma. We were on patrol, Nate continued, his voice distant. Standard route we'd taken dozens of times. Roberts was telling me about his kid's first baseball game, he had it all recorded on his phone, was going to watch it that night. He closed his eyes, but the memories played on regardless. I saw something in his stance change. Just a slight shift. He'd spotted something we'd missed, and he pushed me back. That's what I can't, he didn't hesitate. Didn't even think about it. Just pushed me away and took the full. His voice cracked. Dr. Carter leaned forward slightly, her presence steady and grounding. The worst part, Nate whispered, is that I can't remember if I thanked him. For all those stupid baseball stories. For the awful jokes. For any of it. And now his kid is growing up without a father because he chose to save me instead. And you've been punishing yourself ever since, Dr. Carter said softly. Isolating yourself, refusing to engage with life, as if living fully would somehow dishonor his sacrifice. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. I don't deserve, what would Roberts want, she interrupted, her voice still gentle but firm. From what you've told me about him, about his stories and his jokes, about how he looked out for his unit, what would he want for you? The question hung in the air between them. Nate thought about Robert's easy smile, about how he'd always find ways to lift the team's spirits even during the darkest moments. About how he'd talked about his son with such pride and hope. He'd want me to live, Nate admitted, the realization both painful and freeing. Really live, not just exist. And this past week, with Shadow, have you been more alive? Nate thought about the schedules on his refrigerator, the open curtains, the small victories as Shadow learned to trust him. Yes, he said. But it's terrifying. Why terrifying? Because what if I fail him too? What if I can't be what he needs? Dr. Carter smiled slightly. Interesting choice of words. Not, what if he's too damaged or, what if he can't be helped, you're worried about your ability to help him. That's quite a shift from our previous sessions. Nate blinked, realizing she was right. His concerns had shifted from passive helplessness to active responsibility. Shadow's trainer, Rachel, she said something about new neural pathways, he said. About how healing isn't about erasing the trauma, but building new associations alongside it. She sounds wise, Dr. Carter noted. What new associations are you building, Nathan? He thought about it. That maybe being broken doesn't mean being worthless. That surviving doesn't have to mean just existing. That trust. He paused, gathering his thoughts. That trust can be rebuilt, even when it seems impossible. These are powerful insights, Dr. Carter said. How does it feel to voice them? Scary, Nate admitted. Like I'm betraying something. Someone. Or perhaps, Dr. Carter suggested, you're finally honoring Robert's sacrifice by choosing to truly live, not just survive. The session continued, diving deeper into these new perspectives. When their time was nearly up, Dr. Carter leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. I'd like to try something different for our next sessions, she said. Would you be open to including Shadow sometimes? Not every session, she added quickly, seeing his surprise. But I think his presence might help us explore certain areas more effectively. You work with service dogs. Sometimes. But this would be different. This would be about the unique bond you're developing with Shadow, and how it might help both of you heal. Nate thought about how Shadow's presence helped ground him during nightmares, how the dog seemed to sense his anxiety before he did. "I'll ask Rachel if she thinks he's ready." "Good," Dr. Carter smiled. "That's exactly the right approach, considering his needs first." "You're already thinking like a caregiver, Nathan." As Nate drove home, his mind kept returning to Roberts. For the first time, he tried to imagine his friend's reaction to Shadow, to this halting attempt at healing. He could almost hear Roberts laugh, could almost see him shaking his head and saying, "About damn time, Riley." Shadow was waiting at the door when he got home, his whole body wiggling with barely contained excitement. The dog checked him over thoroughly, sniffing his clothes as if reading the story of where he'd been. "I did it, buddy," Nate told him, kneeling down to accept Shadow's inspection. "Talked about some hard stuff today." "Really talked, not just." He trailed off as Shadow pressed against him, offering the same comfort he did during nightmares. "Yeah," Nate whispered, burying his face in Shadow's slowly healing coat. "I think we're both learning some new tricks, aren't we?" The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Nate's backyard as Shadow cautiously approached the fence line. 2 weeks of Rachel's training sessions had brought subtle but significant changes. The dog moved with more confidence now, his tail occasionally lifting from its perpetual tucked position. "That's it," Rachel encouraged from where she sat cross-legged on the grass. "Let him explore at his own pace." Nate watched as Shadow investigated the perimeter, nose working overtime as he catalogued the various scents. They'd been gradually expanding his comfort zone, moving from inside the house to the backyard, helping him understand that the world could be safe again. A sound from the other side of the fence made Shadow freeze. Maggie Sanders appeared at the gate, carrying her usual Sunday casserole dish. Shadow retreated several steps, positioning himself between the potential threat and Nate. "Sorry," Maggie called softly. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "It's okay," Rachel said before Nate could respond. "This is actually a good opportunity. Would you be willing to help us with something, Ms. Maggie Sanders? I'm the neighbor with the compulsive cooking habit." Her attempt at humor couldn't quite hide the concern in her eyes as she watched Shadow's defensive posture. Rachel smiled. "Perfect. We're working on positive associations with new people. Would you mind sitting with us for a few minutes? Just quiet presence, no pressure." Maggie glanced at Nate, seeking his permission. He nodded, surprising himself with how comfortable he felt about her joining them. 3 weeks ago, he would have retreated into the house at the first sign of company. "I'll just put this in your kitchen first," Maggie said, lifting the casserole dish. Actually, Nate found himself saying, "Maybe you could stay for dinner. If you want, I mean. You've been feeding me for months, seems fair to finally share a meal properly." The surprise and warmth that spread across Maggie's face made something in his chest tighten. How long had she been waiting for him to open that door, even a crack? Rachel observed the interaction with professional interest. "Social reintegration is an important part of recovery, for both of you," she noted. "Shadow needs to learn that his world can safely expand beyond just you, Nathan." They spent the next hour in the backyard, with Rachel guiding them through exercises designed to help Shadow associate Maggie's presence with positive experiences. By the time Rachel left, Shadow had accepted treats from Maggie's hand, a small victory that felt anything but small. "He's doing so well," Maggie said as they headed inside. The kitchen was neater now, evidence of Nate's gradual return to functional living. "You both are." Nate busied himself getting plates, trying to remember the last time he'd eaten with company. "It's slow," he admitted. "Some days are harder than others." "I know something about that," Maggie said quietly. She'd settled into one of the kitchen chairs, watching as Shadow settled into his bed in the corner, close enough to monitor them but no longer pressing against Nate's legs constantly. "My brother, Alex," he struggled after his second tour. "Never quite found his way back." The past tense hung heavy in the air. Nate paused in his dinner preparations, really looking at Maggie for the first time. The sadness in her eyes was familiar, he'd seen it in his own reflection often enough. "Is that why you wouldn't give up on me?" he asked. "All those meals, even when I never answered the door." Maggie's smile was bittersweet. "Partly. Alex used to say the hardest part wasn't the big things, it was the everyday stuff. Making meals, keeping a routine, remembering how to be part of the world." She traced a pattern on the tablecloth. "I couldn't help him in time. But when you moved in, looking so lost, I thought maybe this time I could make a difference." "You did," Nate said softly. "Even when I couldn't show it, knowing someone cared enough to keep trying, it mattered." Shadow got up from his bed and padded over to Maggie, surprising them both by laying his head gently on her knee. She froze, then slowly brought her hand down to stroke his ears. "Look at that," she whispered, tears bright in her eyes. "He knows when someone needs comfort, doesn't he?" "Yeah, he's good at that." Nate watched the interaction with a mixture of pride and something else, hope, maybe. "Rachel says he's developing emotional intelligence, learning to read human cues better. It's part of his healing process." They ate dinner together, the conversation flowing more easily than Nate would have expected. Maggie told stories about Alex, not the hard stories, but the good ones, about his terrible jokes and his love of classic rock. Nate found himself sharing some of his own memories, even managing to talk about Roberts without the usual crushing weight of guilt. "You know," Maggie said as she helped him clear the dishes, "the community center where I volunteer is starting a veterans outreach program. Nothing formal, just a space where vets can gather, maybe work with shelter dogs sometimes. No pressure, but if you ever wanted to check it out." The old anxiety flared briefly, but it was different now, less overwhelming, more manageable. "Maybe," he said. "Not yet, but maybe soon." Shadow followed Maggie to the door when she left, his tail giving that slight wag that was becoming more frequent. She knelt down to his level, speaking softly. "You take care of him, okay? He's important to a lot of people, even if he doesn't know it yet." After she left, Nate and Shadow settled into their evening routine, medication, short walk in the backyard, quiet time in the living room where Nate would read from Rachel's book about canine behavior while Shadow dozed nearby. But tonight felt different, shifted somehow by the simple act of sharing a meal with someone who understood. His phone buzzed, a text from Dr. Carter confirming their next appointment, this time with Shadow included. Another step forward, another small expansion of their world. "Baby steps, right?" he murmured to Shadow, who had migrated to lean against his leg. The dog looked up at him with those knowing eyes, and Nate was struck by how far they'd both come. Not healed, maybe never fully healed, but learning to carry their scars with more grace, finding strength in their shared journey. Through the window, he could see lights coming on in Maggie's house across the street. Another soul carrying her own wounds, yet still finding ways to reach out, to care, to make the world a little gentler for others. Maybe that was the real victory, not in forgetting the past, but in refusing to let it determine the future. The weather forecast had predicted thunderstorms, and Nate could feel it in the air as he and Shadow walked into Dr. Carter's office. The atmospheric pressure made his old shoulder wound ache, a constant reminder of that day in Kandahar. Shadow seemed to sense the coming storm too, his movements more tentative than they'd been in days. "Welcome, both of you," Dr. Carter said, her voice carrying its usual calm. She'd rearranged her office, creating a comfortable space on the floor with cushions and a soft blanket. "Shadow can settle wherever he feels most comfortable." Shadow did a careful circuit of the room, investigating each corner before finally settling close to Nate, but not pressed against him, progress that would have seemed impossible a few weeks ago. "I've spoken with Rachel about his progress," Dr. Carter said, sitting cross-legged on one of the cushions instead of her usual chair. "She's quite impressed with how you're working together." A distant rumble of thunder made Shadow's ears twitch. Nate automatically reached out to steady him, then caught himself. Rachel says I need to let him self-regulate sometimes. Not reinforce the anxiety by being overprotective. That must be difficult, Dr. Carter observed. The instinct to protect is strong, especially given your experiences. Another rumble, closer this time. Shadow shifted but remained in place, his eyes moving between Nate and Dr. Carter. I keep thinking about Roberts, Nate said, watching Shadow's subtle stress signals. About protection. About choices. Tell me about that. Roberts chose to protect me. It was instantaneous, no hesitation. And now, with Shadow. He struggled to find the words. Sometimes I see him checking the rooms before I enter them, positioning himself between me and potential threats. He's trying to protect me, even though he's the one who needs protection. Dr. Carter nodded thoughtfully. And how does that make you feel? Before Nate could answer, a massive thunderclap shook the windows. Shadow bolted upright, his body rigid with fear. But instead of hiding or seeking comfort from Nate, he planted himself firmly between Nate and the window, protecting him from the perceived threat. "Oh, buddy," Nate whispered, his throat tight. "It's okay. We're safe here." Dr. Carter watched the interaction with keen interest. "Shadow's showing remarkable resilience," she noted. "Despite his own fear, his first instinct is to ensure your safety. That speaks to the depth of trust you've built." The storm intensified outside, rain lashing against the windows. Shadow maintained his protective stance, though his trembling was visible now. "Rachel's been working with us on this," Nate said, his voice strained. "Teaching him that it's okay to seek comfort when he's scared, that it doesn't make him weak." He laughed softly, without humor. "Funny how much harder it is to accept that lesson myself." "Why do you think that is?" "Because I'm supposed to be the strong one. The protector. That's what soldiers do, right? But most days, I feel like I'm the one who needs protecting, from my thoughts, my memories, myself." A particularly violent thunderclap made them all jump. Shadow whined but didn't retreat from his post. "Shadow," Dr. Carter called softly. "Come here, boy." To Nate's surprise, Shadow glanced at him briefly before moving toward Dr. Carter. She didn't reach for him, just created a space of invitation. After a moment's hesitation, Shadow settled near her, still maintaining sight lines to both the window and Nate. "See what he did there?" Dr. Carter asked. "He checked with you first, not for permission, but for reassurance that it was safe to trust someone else. He's learning that safety isn't dependent on a single person or place." The revelation hit Nate hard. "Like me with Maggie," he said slowly. "And now you. And Rachel. I'm building a, what did you call it before? A safety network?" "Exactly. Trauma can make us believe we're alone in our battles, that we can only rely on ourselves. But true healing often comes through connecting with others, through allowing ourselves to be supported as well as supporting." Another thunderclap, but this time Shadow stayed calmer, looking to both Nate and Dr. Carter for reassurance. The dog's ability to adapt, to trust, to grow despite his fears, suddenly seemed like a mirror of Nate's own journey. "I've been thinking about the veterans program Maggie mentioned," Nate said, watching Shadow gradually relax despite the continuing storm. "The one with shelter dogs." "Oh." Dr. Carter's tone was encouraging but neutral. "Yeah. I mean, if Shadow and I can help other vets find what we've found." He trailed off, uncertain how to express the mix of terror and hope the idea inspired. "That would be a significant step," Dr. Carter acknowledged. "How does thinking about it make you feel?" "Scared," Nate admitted. "But also, purposeful. Like maybe Robert's sacrifice could mean something more than just my survival. Like maybe it could lead to something, healing." The storm was beginning to pass, its fury spending itself in the distance. Shadow finally relaxed his vigilant posture, moving back to settle between Nate and Dr. Carter, no longer protecting, just present. "I think," Dr. Carter said carefully, that finding purpose in pain, choosing to use our experiences to help others, that's one of the most profound forms of healing we can achieve. She smiled gently. And sometimes, it takes a four-legged friend to show us the way. As if understanding her words, Shadow placed his paw on Nate's knee, his eyes full of that unconditional acceptance that had become Nate's anchor. The program starts next month, Nate said quietly. Maybe Shadow and I could just visit first. See how it feels. Small steps, Dr. Carter agreed. But important ones. The rest of the session passed quietly, the storm fading to a gentle rain. They talked about practical strategies for managing anxiety, about the difference between protective instincts and hypervigilance, about the courage it takes to be vulnerable. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Carter handed Nate a business card. This is for Lisa Chen, Rachel's sister, actually. She coordinates the Veterans Program at the community center. When you're ready, she'd be happy to show you and Shadow around, no pressure or commitment. Nate took the card, feeling its weight in his hand, the weight of possibility, of choice, of moving forward. You know, he said, pausing at the door, Roberts used to say that the hardest part of being a soldier wasn't the fighting, it was knowing when to put down the weapon, when to let others help carry the load. Dr. Carter smiled. Sounds like a wise man. Yeah, Nate agreed, watching Shadow wait patiently by his side, both of them stronger for having weathered the storm together. He really was. The Bristol Community Center looked nothing like Nate had imagined. Instead of the institutional building he'd expected, it was a renovated Victorian house, complete with a wraparound porch and well-tended garden. Shadow's ears perked up as they approached, taking in the unfamiliar environment from the safety of Nate's side. Lisa Chen was waiting for them on the porch, and the family resemblance to Rachel was immediately apparent, the same calm presence, the same careful way of moving. You must be Nathan and Shadow, she said, maintaining a comfortable distance. Rachel's told me wonderful things about you both. Nate's hand tightened slightly on Shadow's leash. We're just here to look around, he reminded her, needing to establish that boundary right away. Of course, Lisa nodded. Why don't we start with the outdoor space? It's usually quieter this time of day. She led them around to a fenced backyard that had been transformed into a series of small garden areas, complete with benches and winding paths. A few people were working in raised vegetable beds, but they seemed absorbed in their tasks, paying no attention to the newcomers. The garden program started organically, Lisa explained as they walked. We found that many of our veterans felt more comfortable working with their hands, being in nature. It gives them a sense of purpose, watching things grow. Shadow's nose worked overtime as they moved through the space, cataloging the new scents. His body language was alert but not tense, progress that made Nate's chest tight with pride. And the dog program? He asked, trying to keep his voice casual. That's mainly in the converted carriage house, Lisa gestured to a building at the far end of the property. Would you like to see it? There's no one there right now, we schedule carefully to avoid overwhelming either the dogs or the veterans. The carriage house had been transformed into a warm, welcoming space with comfortable seating areas and a section clearly designed for dog training. Shadow investigated each corner thoroughly while Lisa explained their approach. We partner with local shelters, focusing on dogs who need extra patience and understanding. Many of them have trauma histories, like Shadow. The veterans who work with them often find that helping these dogs heal helps them process their own experiences. Nate thought about how Shadow's needs had given structure to his days, how the dog's small victories had become his own. Yeah, I get that. A noise from outside, a car backfiring, made them both jump. Shadow pressed against Nate's leg, but recovered quickly, shaking it off just as Rachel had taught him. Nate forced his own breathing to steady, using the grounding techniques Dr. Carter had practiced with him. Lisa watched their mutual recovery with understanding. That's exactly the kind of moment we work with here, she said quietly. How triggers affect both human and dog, how they can help each other through the response. They moved to a small office area where Lisa showed them photos of success stories, veterans and dogs who had helped each other heal. One photo in particular caught Nate's eye, Marine in a wheelchair working with a three-legged German Shepherd. "That's Carlos and Luna," Lisa said, noticing his interest. They both thought they were broken beyond repair. Now they do outreach work in schools, teaching kids about resilience. Something about the image stirred a memory of Roberts talking about his son's school presentations, about the importance of showing kids what real courage looked like. Nate cleared his throat. How does someone start? If they wanted to help. Usually with just this, visiting, getting comfortable with the space. Then maybe sitting in on a few sessions, seeing how it feels. Some veterans prefer working one-on-one with the dogs, others enjoy the group dynamic. We let each person find their own path. Shadow had settled into a perfect downstay near Nate's feet, demonstrating the training that was becoming second nature. Lisa smiled at the sight. Rachel mentioned that Shadow has excellent emotional intelligence. Dogs like that can be particularly helpful with veterans who are just starting to open up to the idea of healing. The responsibility of that possibility felt heavy but not crushing, like a pack he was finally strong enough to carry. I'm not fixed yet," he admitted. "Still have bad days." "We all do," Lisa said simply. "That's why community matters. On your bad days, others help carry the weight. On their bad days, you help carry theirs." They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Maggie stood there, looking slightly sheepish. "Sorry, I saw your car outside. Just wanted to make sure everything was okay." "Maggie's one of our most dedicated volunteers," Lisa said warmly. "She's been instrumental in getting the program running." Nate looked at Maggie with new understanding, how she'd known exactly what he needed all those months, how her persistence had been born of deep personal knowledge. "You never mentioned you worked here." "Didn't want to push," Maggie shrugged. "Some things, people need to find in their own time." Shadow got up and walked over to Maggie, his tail giving that subtle wag that still felt like a miracle every time Nate saw it. She knelt to greet him, and Nate was struck by how far they'd all come from those early days of closed doors and silent meals left on porches. "We have a new group starting next week," Lisa mentioned casually. "Just basics, introduction to dog body language, simple training techniques. No pressure to interact if you don't want to. You'd be welcome to observe." Nate looked down at Shadow, who gazed back with those eyes that had seen him through his darkest moments. "What do you think, buddy? Ready to help some other soldiers find their way back?" Shadow's tail wagged more definitively, not quite the carefree swing of a dog without shadows in its past, but the measured response of one who had learned that joy was still possible, even after pain. "Maybe," Nate said, surprising himself with how right it felt. "Maybe we could try." As they walked back to the car, Maggie fell into step beside them. "You know," she said softly, "Alex would be proud of both of us." Nate thought about Roberts, about choices and sacrifices, about the different ways people could save each other. "Yeah," he replied, watching Shadow walk confidently between them. I think Roberts would be too." The late afternoon sun cast their shadows long across the community center's lawn, not dark shapes to hide from anymore, but proof that they were still here, still standing, still moving forward together. Shadow paused to inspect a butterfly landing on a nearby flower, his posture curious rather than fearful, and Nate felt something shift inside him, like a wound finally beginning to heal clean. "Small steps," he murmured, echoing what had become their mantra. "But important ones," Maggie finished, and her smile held all the understanding in the world. The training room at the community center felt different with other people in it. Nate sat in the back corner, Shadow alert but calm beside him, watching as Lisa welcomed the small group of veterans. There were 5 of them, each carrying visible and invisible wounds of war. A young woman with a prosthetic leg. An older man whose hands wouldn't stop moving. A Marine who kept his back to the wall and his eyes on all the exits, a mirror of Nate's own habits. Today, we're fortunate to have Nathan and Shadow with us, Lisa said, her voice carrying that same steady calm her sister had perfected. They're going to help demonstrate some basics of dog body language and trauma response. Nate's throat tightened. They hadn't discussed him participating, just observing. But Shadow pressed against his leg reassuringly, and he found himself standing. "We've been where you are," he said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "Both of us. And we're still learning, every day." The Marine, who had introduced himself as David, watched Shadow with particular intensity. "How long did it take for him to trust you?" Nate thought back to that first morning, to the frightened dog cornered by animal control. "Trust isn't linear," he said, echoing Rachel's words. "Some days are better than others. But the breakthrough moment wasn't when he learned to trust me, it was when I learned to trust him." Lisa smiled encouragingly. "Would you be willing to demonstrate what you mean?" Nate nodded, taking Shadow through some of the exercises Rachel had taught them. The way they communicated now was almost telepathic, small shifts in posture, subtle changes in breathing. Shadow responded to his cues perfectly, showing how a traumatized dog could learn to feel safe again. "The key is reading their stress signals," Nate explained, pointing out Shadow's ear positions, tail carriage, and other subtle signs. "Just like us, they have triggers. The difference is, they're always honest about their feelings. Unlike us," the woman with the prosthetic, Christina, said with a bitter laugh. "Yeah," Nate agreed. "We get real good at hiding, don't we? At pretending we're fine when we're drowning inside." The group fell silent, the truth of his words hanging heavy in the air. Shadow, sensing the shift in energy, moved to Christina's side and gently placed his head on her knee. "How does he know?" she whispered, her hand hovering uncertainly over Shadow's head. "He reads pain," Nate said softly. "All kinds of pain. And he's learned that sometimes the best medicine is just being present with someone in their darkness." Christina's hand finally settled on Shadow's fur, and something in her face cracked open. I haven't let anyone this close since the IED," the older man, Frank, finished for her. His restless hands finally stilled. "Yeah. Gets real hard to let anything good in when you're so used to losing it." Shadow stayed with Christina but kept eye contact with Nate, demonstrating the balance they'd learned, how to offer comfort while maintaining their connection. Lisa watched with professional appreciation. "This is exactly what we mean by mutual healing," she said. "The dogs help us remember how to be vulnerable, how to trust. And in helping them heal, we often find our own way back." The session continued, with Nate sharing more of what he'd learned from Rachel about dog behavior and trauma response. He found himself talking about his own journey too, not the specifics of his trauma, but the process of healing. How Shadow had given him a reason to get up each morning, how caring for another being had helped him start caring for himself again. David, who hadn't spoken since his initial question, finally broke his silence. "There's a dog at the shelter," he said, his voice rough. "Been there 3 months. Nobody wants her because she's too damaged, too aggressive. But maybe she's just waiting for someone who understands her language," Nate finished. He shared a look with Lisa, who nodded subtly. "Would you like to meet her?" she asked David. "We could arrange a supervised introduction, similar to how Nathan and Shadow started." For the first time, David's rigid posture softened slightly. "Yeah. Maybe." As the session wound down, Christina lingered, still stroking Shadow's fur. "Does it ever go away completely?" she asked. "The fear?" Nate thought about his answer carefully. "No," he said honestly. "But it changes. Becomes more manageable. And sometimes it can even become a kind of strength. Shadow's past makes him more empathetic, more attuned to others' pain. My experiences, they help me understand what others are going through. It's not about erasing the trauma, it's about transforming it into something meaningful. Lisa gathered them for a closing circle, a simple ritual of acknowledgement and support. As they prepared to leave, Frank approached Nate. "My grandson's been asking about my medals," he said, his hands starting their restless dance again. "Can't bring myself to tell him the stories. But maybe if I could show him instead. How healing works. How strength isn't always about fighting." "We'll be here next week," Nate said. "Same time." Shadow's pretty good at helping people find the right words. Outside, the late summer sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of healing. Shadow walked beside Nate with his head high, somehow knowing he'd done good work today. "You did amazing," Lisa said, joining them on the porch. "Both of you. Rachel was right, you have a gift for this." Nate watched David talking quietly with Maggie about arranging a shelter visit, saw Christina walking with more ease in her stride, noticed Frank's hands finally still in his pockets. "It's not us," he said. "It's this. All of us together, finding our way back. Shadow just helps people remember they're not alone in the dark." Shadow looked up at him with those wise eyes, and Nate remembered something Roberts used to say, that the strongest soldiers weren't the ones who never fell, but the ones who learned how to help others back to their feet. "Same time next week?" Lisa asked. Nate felt the weight of the dog leash in his hand, no longer a lifeline, but a connection. A bridge between past and future, between broken and healing, between isolation and community. "Yeah," he said. "We'll be here." And for the first time in longer than he could remember, it felt less like a promise and more like a purpose. The shelter dog's name was Luna, and she reminded Nate so much of Shadow in those first days that it made his chest ache. She was a Belgian Malinois mix, all coiled tension and wary eyes, watching them from the back of her kennel. David stood rigid beside him, his jaw clenched tight. "She was found tied up behind an abandoned building," the shelter worker explained. "We think she might have been used for protection training, but handled poorly." The diplomatic pause spoke volumes. "She's been here 3 months. Most people won't even look at her twice." "I see you, girl," David murmured, and something in his voice made Luna's ears twitch forward. Nate recognized that moment of connection, it was the same one he'd shared with Shadow, that recognition of mutual brokenness. Shadow sat calmly at Nate's side, his presence a steady anchor. They'd been working with Rachel on how to introduce him to other traumatized dogs, preparing for this moment. Luna's eyes kept darting between Shadow and David, assessing, calculating. "What do you think?" Nate asked quietly. David's hands were trembling slightly, but his voice was steady. "She's like me. Trained for one purpose, but that purpose turned poison. And now nobody knows what to do with her." "Nobody except you," Nate said. The shelter had set up a meet and greet area in their fenced yard, following Lisa's protocols for traumatized dog introductions. Rachel was there too, having rearranged her schedule to support this moment. "Remember," she told David, "no expectations. We're just creating a safe space for her to make choices." They followed the same steps Nate had taken with Shadow all those months ago. David sat quietly on the ground, making himself small and non-threatening. Luna was brought out on a long lead, given the freedom to investigate the space at her own pace. "Talk to her," Nate encouraged. "Tell her who you are." David swallowed hard. "I'm like you," he started, his voice rough. "People look at me and see something dangerous. Something broken. I know what it's like to be trained as a weapon, to have that training turn against you. To feel like you can never be safe again." Luna's pacing slowed. Her ears worked back and forth, tracking David's voice. "But I'm learning," David continued, glancing at Nate and Shadow. "Learning that there's more to life than hypervigilance. That trust isn't weakness. That maybe we could figure it out together." Shadow, reading the tension in the air perfectly, lay down in a submissive posture, showing Luna that this space was safe. The female dog's body language shifted subtly, still cautious, but less defensive. "Good," Rachel murmured. "She's responding to both David's energy and Shadow's example." Minute by minute, Luna's circles grew smaller. Like Shadow had done, she seemed drawn to the quiet understanding in David's voice, the lack of demands or expectations. When she finally took a treat from the ground near David's feet, Nate felt the same surge of hope he'd experienced with Shadow. "What happens now?" David asked, not moving as Luna sniffed cautiously at his boot. "Now we build on this foundation," Rachel said. "Daily visits, establishing routine and trust. Are you ready for that commitment?" "More than ready." David's voice had a new quality to it, purpose, maybe. Or hope. Over the next 2 hours, they worked together. Rachel explained the training protocols she'd developed with Shadow, while Nate shared his personal experiences of those early days. Luna gradually relaxed enough to accept treats directly from David's hand, though she still startled at sudden movements. "She'll need a lot of work," the shelter worker warned. "So do I," David said simply. Back at the community center that afternoon, Nate watched David fill out the adoption paperwork with Lisa. Shadow dozed at his feet, tired from his role as canine ambassador. "You did good today," Maggie said, joining them with coffee. She'd started bringing real coffee to their sessions instead of leaving casseroles on porches, a small but significant evolution in their friendship. "Both of you." "It's strange," Nate admitted. "Watching them, it's like seeing our story from the outside. All that fear and uncertainty, but also the possibility," Maggie finished. "The chance to start over." Christina and Frank arrived for their regular session, both pausing to hear about Luna. The group had grown closer over the past few weeks, building the kind of trust that only came from shared understanding. "Another success story in the making," Lisa said warmly, watching David carefully file his copies of the paperwork. "You know, we've had 3 other shelters reach out about starting similar programs." The implications of that hit Nate hard. How many other veterans were out there, drowning in silence? How many dogs were waiting in kennels, their capacity for love buried under layers of fear? He thought about Roberts, about choices and ripple effects, about how saving one life could lead to saving many more. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "About what you said before, about expanding the program. Maybe Shadow and I could help train other handler teams. Share what we've learned." Lisa's face lit up. "That would be incredible. Your experience, combined with Rachel's protocols, we could help so many more veterans and dogs." Shadow's tail thumped against the floor at the change in Lisa's tone. He'd come so far from the frightened dog in Nate's backyard, grown into a confident guide for other traumatized souls. "Roberts would love this," Nate said quietly, more to himself than the others. "Using what we've been through to make something good. Something that helps people find their way back." "Your friend was wise," Maggie said, her hand finding his shoulder briefly. "Yeah," Nate agreed, watching David kneel to show Luna's picture to Christina, who was already offering tips about adapting living spaces for a traumatized dog. "He would have understood all of this. The way we save each other." Shadow got up and pressed against his leg, not from anxiety now, but simple affection. They had learned each other's rhythms so well, become so attuned to each other's needs. And now they were helping others find that same connection, that same path back to trust. "Full circle," Lisa said, watching them with knowing eyes. "From being helped to helping others." Outside, the autumn air was crisp with possibility. Nate could hear David on the phone, presumably with Rachel, already eager to start Luna's rehabilitation journey. Christina was showing Frank a video of her first successful run with her new prosthetic. The community they'd built here was growing, healing, strengthening. Shadow looked up at him with those wise eyes that had seen him through so much, and Nate remembered his words to Luna earlier, "Trust isn't weakness. It had taken a dog to teach him that, to show him that the strongest bonds often came from shared vulnerability. Ready to help some more lost souls find their way home, he asked Shadow. The dog's tail wagged with confident joy, not the hesitant gesture of months past, but the sure response of one who knew his purpose in the world. Yeah, Nate smiled. Me too, buddy. Me too. The call came during one of their training sessions at the community center. Nate was working with David and Luna, showing them how to navigate crowded spaces, when his phone buzzed. The shelter's number flashed on the screen. We have a situation, the coordinator said without preamble. Military working dog, just released from service. Handler was killed in action last month. Dogs not adjusting well to civilian life. We've heard about your program. Nate's throat tightened. Beside him, Shadow tensed, picking up on his shift in energy. How bad? Bad enough that we're running out of options. His name is Atlas. German Shepherd, 5 years old. Highly trained, but the trauma. We've never dealt with anything quite like this. Through the window, Nate could see Luna working through her fear of new obstacles, David's quiet encouragement giving her confidence. They'd come so far in just a few weeks. But this, a military working dog who'd lost his handler in combat, this was different. Send me the details, he said. I'll be there in an hour. Atlas was nothing like Shadow had been. Where Shadow had been fearful and withdrawn, Atlas was all contained aggression, a coiled spring of military precision and raw grief. He stood at perfect attention in his kennel, but his eyes held a darkness Nate recognized all too well. His handler, Staff Sergeant Lauren Chen, was killed in a firefight in Syria, the shelter worker explained, keeping her distance from the kennel. Atlas was wounded trying to protect her. By the time he recovered, she was gone. He's been declining ever since. Chen. Nate asked sharply. Any relation to? My cousin, Lisa's voice came from behind him. She'd followed him to the shelter after his abrupt departure. Lauren was the reason I started working with veterans. She believed in the healing power of the human-animal bond. Atlas's ears twitched at Lisa's voice, a flash of recognition crossing his face before the military mask slipped back into place. Nate approached the kennel slowly, Shadow a steady presence at his side. Hey, warrior, he said softly, using the tone he reserved for his darkest moments with Shadow. I know that look. Wondering why you're here when she's not. Feeling like you failed your mission. Atlas's perfect posture wavered slightly. He hasn't eaten properly in days, the shelter worker said. Won't let anyone close enough to examine him. The military vet cleared him physically, but emotionally. He's not just grieving, Nate realized, watching Atlas's subtle stress signals. He's waiting for orders. Waiting to complete his mission. He turned to Lisa. Do you have any of Lauren's personal effects? Something with her scent? Lisa nodded, tears bright in her eyes. Her family gave me her jacket. It's in my car. When she returned with the jacket, Atlas's composure broke. A high, keening whine escaped him, the first sound they'd heard him make. His nose worked frantically, trying to catch his handler's scent. Stand down, soldier, Nate said firmly, using command tone. Mission complete. She's not coming back. Atlas slammed against the kennel door, all pretense of military discipline gone. The sound he made was pure anguish, the same sound Nate had wanted to make when he'd learned about Roberts. I know, buddy, Nate whispered. I know. Shadow moved closer to the kennel, and for a moment, Nate tensed, but his dog's body language was calm, compassionate. He lay down near Atlas's kennel, offering silent companionship to a fellow warrior. What are his options? Nate asked Lisa. Limited. He's too traumatized for a typical adoption, too highly trained for someone without military dog handling experience. The military would take him back, but But he deserves a chance to heal, Nate finished. He watched Atlas gradually respond to Shadow's calming presence, the rigid posture softening incrementally. The next few hours were a careful dance of trust-building. Nate used his military background to connect with Atlas, speaking in command phrases the dog would understand while gradually introducing civilian comfort words. Shadow demonstrated peaceful behavior, showing Atlas that it was safe to relax. "He's responding to you," Lisa observed as Atlas finally took water from a bowl Nate offered through the kennel bars. "And to Shadow. He needs more than I can give him," Nate admitted. "This kind of trauma, it needs a whole team. What are you thinking?" Nate watched Atlas track Shadow's movements with increasing interest. "Remember how you said other shelters were asking about our program? Maybe Atlas is our chance to show them how it works. Not just rehabilitation, but real integration of military working dogs into civilian life." "A pilot program," Lisa said thoughtfully. "Using our existing veteran dog teams to help military dogs transition. It would honor Lauren's belief in the healing power of these bonds," Nate added softly. Atlas had moved to the front of his kennel, still alert but no longer aggressive. His eyes kept moving between Shadow and Lauren's jacket, as if piecing together a new reality. "It won't be easy," Lisa warned. "He'll need constant supervision, specialized training." "Nothing worth doing ever is," Nate replied, thinking of his own journey. "But we've got something special at the center now, veterans who understand both sides of this story. David and Luna, Christina's engineering skills for any physical adaptations he might need, Frank's patience. And you and Shadow?" Lisa asked. "Are you ready for this level of commitment?" Nate thought about Roberts, about choices and sacrifice, about the ripple effect of healing. He thought about Shadow, once so broken, now helping others find their way back to trust. "Atlas lost his handler protecting her," he said quietly. "Just like Roberts died protecting me. Maybe this is how we honor them both. By helping their sacrifice means something more." Shadow pressed against his leg, offering his usual comfort. Atlas watched this interaction intently, a spark of something, maybe hope, replacing some of the darkness in his eyes. "All right," Lisa said. "I'll make some calls, start setting up the framework for a military dog transition program." "But Nate." She paused, making sure she had his full attention. "This is going to bring up a lot of stuff for you. About Roberts, about your own trauma." "I know," he acknowledged. "But I've got a pretty good support system now." He looked down at Shadow, then back at Atlas. "Besides, sometimes the best way to deal with old wounds is to help someone else heal theirs." Atlas let out a soft whine, different from his earlier anguish, more questioning, more open. Shadow responded with a gentle woof, as if saying, "Welcome to the family, brother." "What do you say, Atlas?" Nate asked softly. "Ready to learn a new mission? One that would make Lauren proud?" The military dog's ears pricked forward, and for the first time, his tail gave a tentative wag. It wasn't acceptance yet, but it was a start. And Nate knew better than anyone that sometimes a start was all you needed to find your way back to life. The autumn air was crisp as Nate stood in the community center's garden, watching Atlas navigate the space. 2 weeks had passed since they'd brought him home, and every day brought small victories and new challenges. The military dog moved with precision through the training course they'd set up, but his eyes constantly searched for threats, for the handler who would never return. "His hypervigilance is actually decreasing," Rachel observed, standing beside Nate with her ever-present notebook. "See how he's starting to check in with Shadow instead of just scanning for threats." It was true. Atlas had formed an unexpected bond with Shadow, seeming to recognize a kindred spirit in the once traumatized dog. Shadow had taken on the role of mentor with natural grace, demonstrating calm behavior and appropriate responses to civilian life. "Lauren would have loved this," Lisa said softly. She'd brought more of her cousin's things, photos, training logs, even Atlas's original puppy records. She always said military dogs needed a better transition program. The garden had become their primary training ground, with David and Luna working alongside them. Christina had designed adaptive equipment for dogs with various combat injuries, while Frank spent hours documenting their methods for other shelters interested in the program. We've got 3 more military working dogs being released next month, Lisa continued. The Army's heard about what we're doing here. They want to make us their official transition facility for the Northeast region. The responsibility of that should have felt overwhelming, but instead, Nate felt ready. He watched as Atlas executed a perfect downstay at David's command, then looked to Shadow for approval. The older dog gave a subtle tail wag, their signal that all was well. It's not just about the dogs anymore, is it? Maggie asked, joining them with her usual coffee offering. It's about all of us learning to come home. Home. The word had such different meaning now than it had 6 months ago, when Nate had been hiding in his grandmother's house, drowning in silence. Now his home was filled with life, Shadow's peaceful presence, regular visits from his newfound family at the center, even Atlas's military precision slowly softening into something more civilian. A car backfired in the distance. Once, this would have sent both humans and dogs into crisis mode. Now, they handled it with practiced grace. Atlas tensed but held his position, taking his cues from Shadow's calm demeanor. David touched Luna's head gently, grounding them both. Christina and Frank continued their conversation without pause. Progress, Rachel smiled. Real, sustainable progress. They gathered in their usual circle for the day's debrief. It had become a ritual, sharing victories, addressing challenges, supporting each other through the hard moments. Atlas sat at perfect attention between Shadow and Luna, slowly learning that he could be both warrior and companion. I had a dream about Lauren last night, Lisa shared suddenly. She was laughing, watching all of this. Said it was better than anything she could have imagined. Atlas's ears pricked at his handler's name, but there was less pain in his response now, more memory than mourning. I dream about Robert sometimes too, Nate admitted. Different dreams now. Less about the explosion, more about the good times. The jokes, the stories, the way he looked out for all of us. That's how we keep them alive, Christina said softly. Not by drowning in grief, but by living the way they taught us to live. By continuing their mission, David added, his hand resting on Luna's head. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden, but they weren't the threatening kind anymore. Shadow lay contentedly between Nate and Atlas, his role as bridge between military and civilian life becoming more natural every day. The Army wants to send someone to observe our methods next week, Lisa mentioned. See how we're managing the transition process. Are we ready for that? Frank asked, his hand steady as he made notes. Nate looked around the circle, at David and Luna's growing confidence, at Christina's innovative design spread across her laptop, at Frank's careful documentation. At Shadow, once so broken, now helping heal others. At Atlas, slowly learning to live without Lauren while honoring everything she'd taught him. Yeah, he said. We're ready. They worked until evening, fine-tuning their protocols, documenting their progress. Atlas moved through advanced obedience exercises while Luna practiced with anxiety-triggering stimuli. Shadow supervised it all with gentle authority, demonstrating the peace that was possible after trauma. As they were packing up, Rachel pulled Nate aside. You know, when we started working with Shadow, I never imagined it would lead to all this. Me neither, Nate admitted, watching Atlas help David collect the training equipment with military efficiency. I was just trying to survive. Didn't think I had anything left to give. And now? Now I understand what Roberts meant about legacy. It's not just about who we lose, it's about who we help live. The garden was quiet now, painted in sunset colors. Shadow and Atlas did a final perimeter check together, one by habit, one by training, both finding purpose in the task. Lauren used to say that the hardest part of working with military dogs wasn't the training, Lisa said, joining them. It was teaching them that it was okay to stand down, to just be dogs sometimes. Same with soldiers, Nate replied, thinking of his own journey. Learning that we don't always have to be warriors. That it's okay to need help, to accept peace. Atlas returned to them, pressing against Lisa's leg briefly, a new behavior, one that showed his growing capacity for comfort. Shadow settled beside Nate, their symmetry a testament to how far they'd come together. The Army observer, Rachel mused, they're expecting to see a dog training program. But what we're really doing here is teaching each other how to live again, Nate finished. Dogs and humans together, finding our way back to wholeness. As they left the garden, Nate paused to watch Shadow and Atlas walk together, one civilian, one military, both healers in their own way. He thought about Roberts, about Lauren, about all the warriors who'd given everything so others could find peace. You'd be proud, he whispered to the evening air. All of you. We're carrying your light forward. The dogs turned to look at him, their eyes reflecting the sunset, Shadow's full of hard-won wisdom, Atlas's showing the first real glimpse of hope. Together, they were writing a new chapter in the story of healing, proving that even the deepest wounds could become bridges to understanding. Come on, boys, Nate called softly. Let's go home. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd found through shared pain and healing, Nate understood that home wasn't just a place anymore. It was this circle of trust, this shared journey toward peace, this endless capacity for love that survived even the darkest battles. Home was wherever they healed together. 1 year. Nate could hardly believe it had been a year since that morning when Shadow had cornered himself in his yard, when both their lives had changed forever. Now, standing in front of the community center's newly expanded facility, he watched as Shadow and Atlas helped welcome their newest arrival, a Belgian Malinois named Ghost, recently retired from Afghanistan. The Army's evaluation of their program had exceeded all expectations. What had started as a small community initiative had grown into something none of them could have imagined. The carriage house had been renovated into a state-of-the-art training facility, with Christina's adaptive equipment designs now being implemented at veterans centers across the country. Ghost's handler made it home, Lisa said softly, joining him on the porch. But the PTSD made it impossible for him to care for her. He'll be joining our program next week, the first time we're rehabilitating handler and dog together. Nate nodded, watching as Shadow demonstrated calm behavior for the nervous Ghost. Atlas maintained a protective perimeter, his military training now channeled into supporting other dogs' transitions. They worked as a seamless team, each understanding their role in helping newcomers find their way back. Did you ever imagine this? Dr. Carter asked, arriving for their weekly group session. She'd integrated her therapy practice with the program, understanding that healing happened best when all aspects of trauma were addressed together. Not in my wildest dreams, Nate admitted. Back then, I could barely imagine getting through each day. The center's garden had expanded, with Frank's therapeutic horticulture program proving as healing for the veterans as the dog training. David and Luna worked with newly arrived veterans, their own journey serving as a blueprint for others. The once traumatized Luna now specialized in helping amputee veterans, having formed a particular bond with Christina during their parallel recovery. Roberts would have loved this place, Maggie said, bringing out coffee for everyone, a ritual that had evolved from those early days of silent casseroles. Alex too. They're here, Nate replied, touching the new memorial wall they'd created. It displayed photos of handlers and dogs who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, including Lauren and Atlas's last mission together. Their spirit is in every life we help rebuild. Inside, the day's activities were beginning. Ghost's handler would arrive soon, and they'd start the delicate process of helping both warriors heal together. The protocols they developed were being studied by military veterinary programs, with Rachel's research gaining national attention. Remember when you thought you couldn't help anyone? Dr. Carter asked quietly. That you were too broken? Nate watched as Shadow expertly guided Ghost through the center's main room, showing her the safe spaces they'd created for overwhelmed dogs. Atlas maintained his watchful presence, but his military bearing now carried a gentleness that would have seemed impossible months ago. "I remember thinking I didn't deserve to heal," he admitted. "That surviving while others didn't meant I had to carry the pain forever. And now? Now I understand that healing isn't a betrayal of those we lost. It's a way of honoring their sacrifice, by helping others find their way back to life." The morning sun filtered through the windows, catching the medals displayed on the wall, not as symbols of war anymore, but as reminders of the courage it takes to choose life after trauma. Frank's grandson often visited now, proud to hear the stories of healing that his grandfather could finally share. "Nathan?" Lisa called from inside. "Ghost's handler is here." Taking a deep breath, Nate prepared to welcome another warrior home. Shadow and Atlas fell into step beside him, their presence steady and sure. Through the door, he could see a young soldier standing rigid, his eyes fixed on Ghost with a mixture of love and terror. "Welcome home, soldier," Nate said softly, recognizing the look of someone standing at the edge of their own healing journey. "You're not alone anymore." The man's eyes filled with tears as Ghost whined softly, recognizing her handler. Shadow moved forward first, offering his calm presence as a bridge between trauma and healing. Atlas stood ready, understanding better than any of them the complex bond between military handler and dog. "How?" the soldier started, his voice breaking. "How do we find our way back?" "Together," Nate answered, feeling the truth of it in his bones. "One day at a time, one step at a time, with people who understand the journey." The center hummed with activity around them, David leading a training session, Christina working with a veteran on prosthetic adjustments, Frank tending the memorial garden with his grandson. Each of them carrying their own scars, each finding purpose in helping others heal. "You know what Roberts used to say?" Nate asked, guiding the soldier toward their welcome circle. "That the bravest thing a warrior can do is ask for help. That true strength isn't in standing alone, but in learning to lean on others." Shadow pressed against his leg briefly, not from anxiety now, but from love. Atlas maintained his watchful guard, while Ghost began to relax, sensing the safety of this space. The soldier's rigid posture softened slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. "This is where healing begins," Nate said, speaking not just to the newcomer but to his past self, to all the wounded warriors still finding their way. "Not in forgetting, but in transforming our pain into purpose. In helping others carry their burdens until they're strong enough to stand again." The morning light filled the room, touching each face in their circle, human and canine, military and civilian, all bound together by the shared journey toward healing. Shadow, once so broken, now helped guide others toward trust. Atlas, who'd lost everything, had found a new mission in protecting this sacred space of recovery. "Ready to begin?" Nate asked softly. The soldier looked at Ghost, at the understanding faces around him, at the photos on the memorial wall. "Yes," he whispered. "We're ready." And as they settled into their healing circle, Nate felt the presence of all those who'd brought them to this moment, Roberts, Lauren, Alex, and countless others. Their legacy lived on in every life touched, every soul mended, every warrior who found their way home. Shadow rested his head on Nate's knee, his eyes full of the wisdom that had helped heal them both. Atlas sat at attention, honoring his dual nature as both warrior and healer. Ghost began to relax into her handler's tentative touch, remembering the bond that trauma had threatened but could never break. Together, they were writing a new chapter in the story of war and peace, proving that even the deepest wounds could become wellsprings of healing. In this sacred space between battle and home, they had found their true mission, helping lost souls find their way back to life, one heart at a time. And in that moment, surrounded by the family he'd found through shared pain and mutual healing, Nate finally understood what Roberts had meant about legacy. It wasn't about the battles they'd fought or the scars they carried. It was about the lives they touched, the hope they rekindled, the light they kept burning for others still finding their way through the darkness. This was their true victory, not in war, but in peace. Not in forgetting, but in transforming. Not in standing alone, but in healing together. This was home.